General Assembly, I would like to thank His Excellency Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros, for the statement delivered, and I request a protocol to accompany His Excellency.
De seguido,
I'm happy to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Gabon to introduce an address by the head of state.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce a statement, pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Ali Bongo Ondimba, President of the Gabonese Republic and head of state, to the general debate of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, Your Majesties, heads of state and government, ministers and heads of delegation, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, at the start of my remarks, I would like to extend my warm congratulations to you on your outstanding election to the presidency of this 76th session of the General Assembly. I am delighted by the hope aroused by your vision as well as your perfect knowledge of international affairs. I would also like to extend my congratulations to your predecessor, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for the remarkable work accomplished in a particularly difficult context. To you, Mr. Secretary General, I reiterate my warm congratulations on your re-election and my full support for your dynamic action throughout your first mandate, as well as my confidence in your future action to find lasting solutions to the many threats and challenges facing our organization. Mr. President, the proposed theme for this session's general debate, Building Resilience Through Hope to Recover from COVID-19, Rebuild Sustainably, Meet the Needs of the Planet, Respect the Rights of People, and Revitalize the United Nations, gives me an opportunity to share our thoughts on the major challenges of the day. As you are aware, the unprecedented health crisis generated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which remains significant, has completely disrupted our societies, our economies, and our coexistence. The development of several vaccines through international collaboration and the ongoing vaccination campaigns in many countries are a beacon of hope for humanity. Vaccination is the only truly effective way to stop the spread of the virus. Mr. President, combining all of our efforts to end the coronavirus pandemic is, in my view, an opportunity to overcome other major crises facing humanity. Indeed, COVID-19 has revealed the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our economies, as well as those of our health systems, forcing us now to think differently about our development models so as to make them more resilient. Some developed countries already intend to relocate all or part of their strategic productive systems in order to reduce their external dependence. Africa should also be part of this paradigm shift in order to put an end to the crises that hinder its development. This will also require an ability to build basic infrastructure capable of guaranteeing the safety of populations, as well as zero tolerance towards corruption and efficient management of public resources. We will also need to train quality human capital, invest significantly and urgently in health infrastructure, and finally, break the vicious cycle of dependence on primary raw materials. Our economies must therefore industrialize to create more wealth by taking full advantage of the aforementioned human capital and our natural resources. To this end, rigorous and transparent debt management, as well as that of resources linked to the export of raw materials, is essential during the transition phase. Finally, we must more than ever accelerate the digital transition and mobilize internal resources by strengthening financial inclusiveness, especially for women. Overall, we need to draw lessons from this pandemic and rebuild our societies in a more sustainable, just, and inclusive manner. I once again call on the leaders of the world to exercise greater multilateralism in order to together build a world economy that takes into account the aspirations of the people who would like to see a more equitable sharing of vaccines and fruits of technological progress. In this pivotal phase and this juncture, it is fundamental that we meet the just imperatives of our universal conscience, including an equitable distribution of technological gains. Otherwise, we risk seeing the cementing of an international order that is a source of human fragility, mistrust between nations, and global insecurity. Mr. President, another issue that calls for solidarity, and one that must be addressed as a priority, is the climate security of our planet. The 26th Conference of the State Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to be held in Glasgow, Scotland this November, should therefore be an unprecedented moment of action. To recall, its objective is to halve greenhouse gas emissions and preserve biodiversity while promoting investments in green infrastructure in developing countries in order to stimulate and decarbonize their economies. Indeed, the impacts of climate change, including rising sea levels, earthquakes, recurrent forest fires, and others, put our societies and communities under great pressure and compel us to act urgently and collectively. These phenomena interplay with the socioeconomic and political issues in our countries, highlighting risks such as political and economic instability, food insecurity, and large-scale migration, among others. States and communities must now adapt in order to face the challenges of climate change. In addition, without prejudice to mitigation, the international political agenda requires a significant increase in resources dedicated to adaptation to climate change. I remain convinced that no single government can tackle adapting to climate change on its own. International cooperation is therefore essential, in my opinion, to support local action, both as a means of strengthening international security and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. President, the link between climate change and insecurity thus appears to be fairly obvious as far as I'm concerned. As you are aware, Gabon has always been committed to peace and climate security. This commitment will remain unwavering throughout my country's mandate as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council for the period 2022-2023. While rejoicing in the confidence of the international community, I would like to reiterate my firm willingness to work hard on the process of silencing the guns everywhere and to resolutely place our action in the context of a permanent search for a global consensus promoting the security, dignity, and prosperity of the peoples of the world. Gabon will seize every opportunity to call for an advent of a more just international order marked by a reform of the UN Security Council, which includes both equitable representation within the Council and an improvement of its working methods, in line with the African Common Position expressed by the Azulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Along with greater international solidarity and the expected reform of the Security Council, the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly and of ECOSOC must also be carried out in order to breathe new momentum into our organization. These reforms are essential as they are able to significantly impact the achievement of several Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, including responding to the legitimate aspirations of the African peoples contained in Agenda 2063. Mr. President, the hope of sustainably rebuilding our governance models and meeting the needs of the planet requires respecting and fulfilling the commitments made. I refer in particular to the transfer of clean technologies and improving access to renewable energies in order to speed up transition to a low-carbon industry that respects the environment. The implementation of these commitments is key to supporting the efforts of countries like Gabon, which has substantially mobilized its domestic resources in the implementation of projects to adapt to climate change and preserve biodiversity. As part of its investment in climate security, Gabon annually sequesters the equivalent of 140 million tons of CO2 while it emits only 35. Thus, with a difference of more than 100 million tons of carbon each year, Gabon's action is decisive for the future of all mankind. The recognition of Ivindo National Park as a World Heritage Site, following the same for Lope Park, affirms the universal and exceptional value of our protected areas. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our partners and friends and all of those who, through their multifaceted support, are accompanying our efforts to conserve and sustainably manage our forests. Mr. President, like many oil-producing countries, Gabon has been hit hard by the impact of the drastic drop in commodity prices. This situation has led to a slowdown in our economic activity. In this context, I instructed the government to set up a transformation acceleration plan. This program aims to revive our economy by accelerating the transition to a post-oil paradigm and emphasizing new engines of growth whose potential could be increased. These include the mining, forestry, and agricultural sectors. In addition, Gabon is strengthening its energy capacity through the upcoming completion of new solar and hydroelectric power plants in order to give new impetus to its industrialization process. Beyond infrastructure development, the intended effect of the implementation of this recovery plan is to ensure fiscal adjustment and promote the private sector as levers for diversification and transformation of our national economy. In the education sector, the government is continuing to mobilize significant resources in order to optimize the education system and bring it into alignment with the demands and the real needs of the labor market. Mr. President, inclusion is another major concern in the policies of my country. This is the thrust of the equal opportunity policy that I have promoted in favor of more equitable development, with particular focus on the empowerment of women and young people, while ensuring that no one be left behind. Regarding the issue of parity, Gabon is one of the countries in Africa where women are the most present and represented in public life. The Prime Minister, President of the Senate, President of the Constitutional Court, Mayor of Libreville, governors, among others, all of these positions, among the most prestigious in the Republic, are held in my country by women, in whom I reiterate my full confidence. It is my first firm conviction that in a globalized and competitive world, gender parity is a matter of social justice, equality, equity, and efficiency. Indeed, a country must be able to identify its talents and its skills, to leverage them, and to promote them without any gender distinction. Mr. President, development cannot be sustainable without peace and stability. Yet, unfortunately, peace continues to be threatened in many parts of the world. The price of instability caused by terrorism or armed groups is particularly heavy for many African countries, which are forced to devote substantial resources to these phenomena that are sustained, among other things, by the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and wildlife trafficking. A comprehensive, united approach appears essential to me in this fight that we wage against these sources of instability and fragility in a number of regions of Africa. We must realize that any threat against one nation constitutes a threat against all. Mr. President, Gabon remains resolutely engaged within the United Nations, as it has always been, in the promotion of stability and peace on the continental level, in Central Africa, and particularly in the Central African Republic. Security sector reform should be supported in the Central African Republic in order to enable the country to equip itself with national defense and security forces with appropriate human, material, and logistical resources. The goal is to allow for the force's strategic deployment throughout the entire territory of the country in order to restore state authority, ensure the security of people and property, and promote the returns of displaced IDPs and refugees. All this will inevitably contribute to the gradual disengagement of foreign forces operating in the CAR on the basis of bilateral or multilateral agreements. It is also essential to continue operationalizing national institutions in order to contribute significantly to guaranteeing the non-repetition of serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in this country. The efforts of the Central African authorities to strengthen social cohesion and the economic recovery of the country should also be supported in order to consolidate gains and guarantee lasting security. To this end, we call on the international community and donors to maintain providing adequate financial support in order to ensure stability and restore hope to the Central African people. Mr. President, building a better world will always be a shifting target as long as a number of people remain subject to unfair sanctions. I would therefore like to reiterate a solemn appeal for the total lifting of the embargo, which has been severely affecting the Cuban government and people for several decades. In conclusion, it is my pleasure to reaffirm Gabon's commitment to multilateralism and greater international solidarity, which remain, and I am convinced of this, our most secure assets for building a more resilient organization, one that is able to cope effectively with the challenges and threats facing humanity. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Gabonese Republic for the statement just made. The Assembly will hear an address by Our Excellency Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania. I request protocol to escort Our Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations Our Excellency Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania, and to invite her to address the Assembly.
Thank you, Chair. Your Excellency Abdullah Shahid, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let me commence by joining previous speakers in applauding you, Mr. President, for being elected to preside over the 76th session of this August Assembly and for the exemplary manner in which you have been presiding over this session. I also commend you for the able manner in which you mastered to make possible for us to meet physically despite unprecedented circumstances brought by COVID-19 pandemic. The holding of physical general debate this year, albeit with limitations, demonstrates again that humanity and multilateralism cannot and should not succumb to the virus. And thus, where there is a will, there is a way. This spirit is what we need going forward. It is why I support and subscribe to the theme of this 76th session that call all of us to build resilience through hope, to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainability, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the lives of the people, and revitalize the United Nations. Mr. President, this is my maiden speech at the United Nations General Assembly. Allow me, on behalf of the people and the government of the United Republic of Tanzania, to thank all members of the United Nations for your condolence message extended to our nation following the untimely passing of our late President, Dr. John Pombe Magufuli, on 17th March this year. May his soul continue to rest in eternal peace. We remain indebted to you for the thoughtful of comforting messages which helped us to prevail over that in unprecedented taste to our nationhood. It is in the same vein that I thank the outgoing President of the 75th session for dedicating a slot on the 59th plenary meeting of the General Assembly on 16th of April 2021 to pay tribute to our beloved late President Dr. Magufuli. Indeed, this was a gesture of solidarity and brotherhood. Mr. President, it is not by sheer coincidence that I chose to attend the United Nations General Assembly as my first trip outside Africa since I took the office. I did so out of my deep sense of conviction and faith in multilateralism, in solving multitude of challenges that our world faces today. I'm here to assure you that under my stewardship, Tanzania will remain a formidable member of the United Nations and a dependable supporter of multilateralism. We'll keep our arms open to those who embrace us and engage with us. We'll continue to be Tanzania that you have known and relied on, a Tanzania that peacefully and respectfully coexisted and cooperated with all countries, big or small, mighty or weak, rich or poor, to make this world, our world, a better place for all of us. Mr. President, COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us how vulnerable we are as individual countries, regardless of our size, wealth, or geography. As we meet here today, we have less than a decade ahead to meet our collective commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I note with great regret that according to the Sustainable Development Goals report of 2020, right now, the world is not on track to achieve the 2030 agenda, mainly due to adverse impact of COVID-19. The report further shows that in some areas, this pandemic has even reversed the progress that was already achieved years back. For instance, it is expected that around 71 million people who got out of extreme poverty will be pushed back into that situation because of this pandemic. What is depressing is the fact that these impacts are not felt evenly. We in the developing world are the most affected. It is therefore imperative that concerted efforts are undertaken to address this devastating situation. Mr. President, developing nations must be assisted in addressing socioeconomic impact of out of COVID-19. On this note, we are thankful to multilateral financial institutions for their efforts in saving many economies from collapsing. These kinds of interventions are important. We cannot afford to take refuge on the onset of COVID-19 as an excuse for not making sufficient progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. President, Tanzania has not been spared by COVID-19. After the onset of the pandemic, we in Tanzania, and I believe in many other developing countries, were stuck in the twilight of protecting lives and protecting livelihoods. Measures advocated by the World Health Organization were geared towards protecting lives. However, in an economy like Tanzania, consisting of a bigger proportion of people living on subsistence economy, whom we need to keep them afloat, my country therefore adopted all necessary measures to curb the spread of COVID-19, including joining the COVAX facility to ensure that Tanzania gain access to the COVID-19 vaccine. The vaccination campaign has started in July this year with the most vulnerable communities and later on other age groupings. Mr. President, globally, when COVID-19 vaccines were being developed, some of us were hopeful that this would mean something good to all of humanity. Nevertheless, we have come to learn that the virus is moving faster than the global production of distribution of vaccines. And the vast majority of vaccines have been administered in high and upper middle income countries. With the current pace, it is less likely that we'll meet the WHO threshold of vaccinating at least 40% of people in every country by end of 2021 and at least 70% by the first half of 2022. The level of vaccine inequity that we see is appalling. It is truly disheartening to see that whilst most of our countries have inoculated less than 2% of our populace and thus seek more vaccines for our people, other countries are about to roll out the third dose, calling it booster vaccine. We tend to forget that nobody is safe until everyone is safe. It is indispensable that countries with surplus COVID vaccine doses share them with other countries. On another note, it is our humble request that the patent rights on COVID-19 vaccines should be waived for developing countries so that they can afford to produce the vaccines. This is not only a necessary move to end this pandemic, but also the right thing to do in order to save humanity. Mr. President, on economic fronts, the United Republic of Tanzania, like other countries, has not been spared by the effects of the COVID-19. Before the pandemic, our economy was growing at the steady rate of 6.9% compared to the current growth rate estimated at 5.4%. We are now embarking on reviving the tourism sector, which was badly affected because of travel restrictions put in many countries as means to curb the spread of COVID-19. While slowly trying to revive most economic activities suffocated by the pandemic, the government continues to work hard to improve the business environment and attract more investment. Aware of the nexus between economic growth and governance, we managed to maintain peace and political stability with a vibrant democracy and institutionalized good governance practices, upholding rule of law and human rights. Mr. President, I wish to take note of the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, which raises key issues of our common concern, such as gender equality, climate change, and youth development. On gender equality, COVID-19 is threatening to roll back the gains which we have made. As the first female president in the history of my country, the burden of expectation to deliver gender equality is heavier on my shoulders. It is for this reason that I commend the initiative by the UN Women, France and Mexico to organize the Generation Equality Forum that took place in Paris in June this year, whereby my country volunteered to champion for women's economic rights and justice. Aware that being passionate about gender equality is not sufficient, my government is reviewing policy and legal frameworks in order to come up with actionable and measurable plans to ensure economic empowerment of women, but also other aspects pertaining to gender equality and gender parity. We are also working on designing and implementation gender-responsive macroeconomic plans, budget reforms, and stimulus packages with the objective of reducing the number of women and girls living in poverty. Mr. President, the challenges of climate change are really affecting livelihoods, peace and security, and forceful displacement of our people. Tanzania government spends 2 to 3% of GDP to mitigate and build resilience of communities. And this is a lot in a country which is still grappling with poverty coupled with the emergency of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has compromised our capacity to respond to harmful impact of climate change. Therefore, our actions today determine the future of our planet in terms of climate change. And in this regard, I call for transparent modality for financial disbursement and emphasize that developed countries should fulfill their commitment to contribute $100 billion annually by 2025 so as to facilitate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Mr. President, in conclusion, I wish to echo my country's commitment in pursuing the principles of multilateralism as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I urge other nations to continue supporting this august institution. The onset of COVID-19 has given to all of us a lesson that we are deeply intertwined and that unilateralism will not get us anywhere when it comes to challenges that transcends our national boundaries. A wise person once said, and I quote, "Alone, one will go faster, but together we'll go far. Multilateralism must always prevail." Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the United Republic of Tanzania for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liberia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Dr. George Manneh Weah, President of the Republic of Liberia. I thank you.
His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th Section of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, heads of state and government, ambassadors, heads of delegations, esteemed delegates, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased and honored to address the 76th sessions of the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the government and people of Liberia. I want to use the occasion to congratulate His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid on his elections as President of the 76th sections of the United Nations General Assembly, and avail to him Liberia's further support in the fulfillment of his duties and responsibility. I also wish to congratulate His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır for his distinguished stewardship in steering the affairs of the 75th sections of the General Assembly. Let me also congratulate His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres on his elections for his second term as Secretary General of the United Nations, which began on January 1st, 2022. Mr. Secretary General, I commend and thank you for your continuous diligence and commitment to the work of the United Nations and for ably steering its affairs, even in the face of unprecedented challenges. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the negative social, economic impact and health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic remind us of the measure of work that is required at the global and national level to combat these pestilence. This is reflected in the theme for this 76th session, Building Resilience through Hope to Recover from COVID-19, Rebuild Sustainably, Response to the Needs of the Planet, Respect the Rights of People, and Revitalize the United Nations, and have due regards for the fundamental human rights which are enshrined in the charter of this noble institution. Meanwhile, it is important that we pay heartfelt tribute to the courageous and dedicated public health workers around the world for their continual selfless service in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. The world owes to them a debt of gratitude. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this General Assembly also calls for a revitalization of the United Nations to make it more relevant and effective in the true fulfillment of its mandate in a changing world. This is a task that has been recognized as an imperative priority by successive previous leaders and members of the organization in recent times.